Hi, welcome back to my office. Today we're going to continue our journey learning about organizational behavior. We have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started.
In Chapter 3, we'll be going over individual differences and perception. Learning objectives for this chapter include being able to define personality and how it affects work behaviors, understanding the role of values in determining those work behaviors, explain the process of perception and how it affects work behaviors as well as understanding how individual differences affect ethics and cross-cultural influences on individual differences and perception. So let's get started. One of the first things we think of when we think about individual differences is the interactionist perspective. In the interactionist perspective, what we're really concerned about is not whether or not an organization has the right kind of culture or whether or not a person has the right kind of personality. Rather, it's does the person fit the organization and does that person fit their job? Those are the two types of fit we most commonly talk about in organizational behavior. For person-organization fit, we're talking about the degree to which a person's values, personality, goals, and other characteristics match those of the organization. When we're talking about person-job fit, it's the degree to which a person's skill, knowledge, abilities, and other characteristics match the job demands. In discussing this, how can we assess person-job fit before hiring employees? What are the methods you think might be useful in this regard? How can a company determine person-organization fit before hiring employees? Which methods do you think would be helpful? Are they the same or different as person-job fit? What can organizations do to increase person-job and person-organization fit after they've hired employees? Really, we're going to talk a lot about that in the chapter on organizational change. Another thing beyond fit that we talk about in this chapter is values. Values refer to stable life goals that people have, reflecting what is most important to them. And as you might imagine, that makes a big difference in how people interact and think about things in their personal lives and at work. Two of the values that we talk about in this book are terminal and instrumental values. Examples of terminal values include things like really valuing a world of beauty, an exciting life, family security, inner harmony, self-respect. Those are examples of terminal values. Versus instrumental values like being broad-minded or clean or forgiving or imaginative or obedient. And so they're different and yet interrelated ways to think about values and how they influence people at work.
Okay, so that covers the material. Remember, you can always go back and review the video if you want to catch back up on things that we've covered. But at this point, I'd like to shift gears to a new topic. Let's dive right back in.
Personality is another individual difference that we care quite a bit about because it impacts so much of the individual, group, and organization. Personality encompasses the relatively stable feelings, thoughts, and behavioral patterns a person has. If you're a person, you've got a personality. One of the most comprehensive and studied personality traits are the Big Five personality traits. Here, researchers over decades have really thought about what captures the total sum of personality. The jury is still out whether or not these five capture everything, but what research has shown is that they capture a great deal. If we know how open, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, and neurotic a person is, we know a lot about how they'll behave at work and how well they'll fit into different types of jobs. Let's go over these because it is so critically important. Openness would be described as someone who's curious, original, intellectual, creative, and open to new ideas. Conscientious individuals are organized, systematic, punctual, achievement-oriented, and dependable. Extroverted individuals are outgoing, talkative, sociable, and enjoy being in social situations. Those who are agreeable are nice, tolerant, sensitive, trusting, kind, and warm. And those who are neurotic are anxious, irritable, aggressive, temperamental, and moody. And you might look at how these are organized. If you need a tip on thinking about how to remember each of these 5 traits, you can think of the acronym OCEAN, OCEAN, to help you remember the big 5 personality traits. When we think about these, the one that's related most frequently to job performance and training performance is conscientiousness, and that makes a lot of sense. The Myers-Briggs type indicator is something that you may have experienced or you may experience down the line. Here, people take a test or an inventory and they reply to those, and then they get a score on how extroverted or introverted they are, how sensing or intuitive they are, how much they engage in thinking or feeling, and how much they engage in judgment versus perception. So this is another way to think about personality as well. And what this can be really useful for is understanding your own personality relative to those around you. So often in organizations, people will take these and then share the results so that they can understand one another and their work styles better.
So at this point, we've covered quite a bit of theory on this topic, but I'd like to get into a specific application or example, because what I found for students is this really helps you bring it from the book to real life. Let's get back to it now.
Imagine you're working with a negative person. What can you do to help deal with this? Well, I think first off, you can understand that you're unlikely to change someone else's personality. That's one of the true factors that we know about personality, that it's relatively stable. I would also say to keep an open mind. Set a time limit. How willing are you to really continue to invest in a relationship if the person is not able to work with you in a more positive manner? It doesn't mean you'll change their personality, but how they interact with you is important. You may also empower the person to act on the negatives they mention. So if they're always bringing up a problem, perhaps coming up with a solution will help change their mind or give them something positive to do. And you can also ask for specifics and find out more about what's going on with this individual. There are a lot of other personality traits. The field of psychology, as well as organizational behavior, is full of a lot of them. In this chapter, we cover several. Let's go over those quickly, and they're in more detail in the book. Negative and positive affectivity are really people's approach. If you think about the big 5 personality, neuroticism can be thought of as similar to negative affectivity, and low neuroticism as positive affectivity. It's really people's mood. And we might ask people in general, how do you feel? And you might ask them also, in this moment, how do you feel? And that's a way to get a sense for people's mood, especially if you're studying customer service or things like that. Self-monitoring is how much an individual is able to tailor the presentation that they have of themselves in different situations. So if the situation calls for someone to be outgoing, they can be more outgoing. And if a situation calls for someone to be more thoughtful and reserved, they may be more thoughtful and reserved. Proactive personality refers to how much a person sees something that they might want to change and then goes ahead and changes it. So really going ahead and seizing the moment is someone who has a proactive personality. We all know what self-esteem means in general, and in the research around self-esteem shows that it's incredibly important for understanding OB. Self-efficacy is also very important for understanding performance and how individuals differ in their beliefs about what they can do. Self-efficacy might be general. In general, I'm really good at doing things, or it might be specific. I'm really good at playing tennis. So it's your confidence related to an ability. And locus of control is another personality trait that is important in how people think about the world around them. Someone who has an internal locus of control, you might think of this co-varying with proactive personality, believes that they can change their fate, that they can make a difference and they can make things happen. Someone who has an external locus of control more believes in fate. Things are going to happen no matter what you do, and learning to accept them is important. As you might imagine, that's going to make a difference in how people engage with the world and what they expect and do at work. Time for another OB toolbox. Ways to help build your self-confidence. We know that self-efficacy is incredibly important. We know that general self-efficacy can be rather stable, but that situational self-efficacy can matter. So one thing you can do to help with your confidence is understand where you're at now. You can take a self-inventory. You can use goal setting to set manageable goals. You can help find a coach or mentor to help you be more confident. You can focus on your successes rather than just judging yourself based on your failures. The whole fake it till you make it really matters when it comes to confidence. Until you can feel confident, you can be sure to act confident, and that actually helps people over time. And know when to ignore negative advice. Throughout this book, we talk about how important feedback is and how important it is to take that in. But if you have people who are negative all the time and you've thought about the advice and it just doesn't seem relevant, that might be a time to ignore it. Personality testing is also really important because it's done so much in employee selection context. Companies such as Kronos or Hogan Assessments conduct pre-employment personality tests, and the Fortune 500 pay these companies quite a great deal of money, and a lot of the resources go around personality testing as it's relevant for different jobs. So understanding personality and how that relates can also be more effective when you're going out there and looking for a job.
Okay, so we've thought about this in terms of the book and in terms of the theory and examples in other people's lives. At this point, I'd like you to take some time to think about how this applies to your own life. Again, is this something that you might have encountered at work? Is this something that you might be able to use to be more effective in a team at school? Or is this something that might help you in your personal life? Again, we're building a toolbox. You're trying to think of more and more ways to make yourself more effective in terms of your relationships with others and organizational behavior.
Think about the personality traits that we've covered in this section. There were quite a few of them. Can you think of jobs or occupations that seem particularly suited to each trait? Which traits would be universally desirable across all the jobs, if any? What are the unique challenges of managing employees who have low self-efficacy and low self-esteem? How would you deal with this situation? And have you ever held a job where your personality did not match the demands of the job? If so, how did you react to this situation, and how were your attitudes and behaviors affected? And finally, can you think of any limitations of developing an ideal employee profile and looking for employees who fit that profile while hiring?
Okay, so that wraps that portion up. At this point, we're going to move on to something new. So let's go ahead and jump back in.
Next up, we'll be talking about perception. Perception is how individuals detect and interpret environmental stimuli. There's visual perception, which is incredibly important. One of the things that it indicates is you can't always trust what you see with your own eyes, because our visual perception goes beyond the information physically available. And as you see in this figure here, there's a white triangle in the middle. But if you think about it, there isn't. What you're seeing is the lack of space, the lack of the red around that triangle, implying that it's there, and yet it's not. If you're like me, you can see that triangle very clearly, while you can also see the circles that look kind of like mini Pac-Mans. Another example of visual perception is this one. So which circle is bigger? Is it the circle in the middle on the left, or is it the circle in the middle on the right? What we find is the circle appears bigger when it's surrounded by smaller circles than it is by the one with large circles around it. So although the circles are identical, the appearance is dramatically different by the context around it. This is something really important to think about in terms of visual perception, but also in other perceptions where we might have bias based on something that happened yesterday, or something that happened in the past, or something that we think about an individual. What is the context in which we might be perceiving them and coming up with some assumptions? Self-perception is also very important. The book covers in detail self-enhancement bias, where we try and make ourselves think better about ourselves, self-effacement bias, and false consensus error. For example, self-enhancement bias might be where you think if something good happens, it's because of things you've done, whereas if something bad happens, you blame somebody else. So there are all sorts of different perceptions, and they can be biased. Social perceptions also are influenced by our values that we talked about, emotions, feelings, and personalities, which in turn can influence our actions. So if you think about this figure and how things are flowing, it's important to break down each of these and really understand them so that we don't make incorrect assumptions. Some incorrect assumptions that we might fall into are stereotypes, where we think of an individual having a group characteristic without it really actually being true. Self-fulfilling prophecy, where we believe something so strongly that we act to make it happen. And selective perception. For example, if you've ever gotten a new car, all of a sudden you see that brand of car everywhere on the road. Doesn't really mean there are more of those cars, so if you're acting on that information, that would be misleading. Social perception also comes into play during selection, such as during an interview. First impressions are initial thoughts that we form about people, and they tend to be stable and salient to contrary information. For better or for worse, we know that the first few seconds of an interview are critical in people's assessment.
All right, so that covers the theory. Now I'd like to jump in to the application, or what people are doing in the world of work. All right, let's get to it.
How can I make a great first impression on the job interview? First, your first opportunity to make a good impression starts before the interview, the moment you send in your resume. You want to make sure that you've done that as professionally as possible and had people look it over. You also want to be prepared for the interview. That means doing research, practicing, maybe even having yourself videotaped and getting feedback. Research the company. What can you find out about it? Is there anyone you know who you can ask? Glassdoor.com has information anonymously posted about companies. There's a lot of information out there. When you're invited for an office interview, that's great. Be sure to dress properly. Be on time to the interview. That means really actually being early. And during the interview, be polite. All of these things sound like common sense, but it's amazing how many times I've heard from employers that some candidates don't take these simple actions. Next up, when we think about perception, is attribution theory. This theory thinks about how we really focus on other people. Will we make an internal or an external attribution? An internal attribution would be something about what the individual did. It's really because of them that something good happened. While an external is really something an outside force or they got lucky has occurred. Consistency refers to how often that individual has done this. Is this something that has only happened once that's good or bad, or is it something over time that you've observed about them? Consensus refers to other people. How much do other people have a similar or dissimilar situation to that? And distinctiveness is how out of character this is for the individual. If we find that something is very consistent, there's consensus, and it's not distinct, we're probably going to make an internal attribution for good or for bad. If we find that the consistency is low, the consensus, depending on if the consensus is around something positive or negative, if only one person is the one who had it happen and it seems to be in character, then we might make an external attribution. What we know from the fundamental attribution error is that people tend to make external attributions when something bad happens to them and internal attributions when something good happens to them. I worked hard, so I got that promotion. On the other hand, when we think about other people, we tend to give their success an attribution of external, and when bad things happen, to blame the victim. Here you see a table where we might have high consensus, high distinctiveness, and low consistency leading to external attributions, with low consensus, low distinctiveness, and high consistency leading to internal. Let's discuss and reflect on this. Is there such a thing as a good stereotype? And is a good stereotype useful or still problematic? How do we manage the fact that human beings develop stereotypes? How would you prevent stereotypes from creating unfairness in decision making? Is it possible to manage the attributions other people make about our own behavior? Let's assume that you've completed a project successfully. How would you maximize the chances that your manager will make an internal attribution? How would you increase the chances of an external attribution when you fail in a task? This is a complex concept, but thinking about it can be effective in helping you down the line. And then finally, personality around the globe. We have seen self-reported self-esteem from around the world, and different countries rated on on this factor. The highest are Serbia, Chile, Israel, Peru, Estonia, the US, Turkey, Mexico, Croatia, and Austria. And the lowest 10 countries are South Korea, Switzerland, Morocco, Slovakia, Fiji, Taiwan, Czech Republic, Bangladesh, Hong Kong, and Japan. If you have any experience with any of these countries, it might be interesting to consider why you think this might be.
All right, thanks for joining me as we covered these organizational behavior topics. As always, I've enjoyed our time together, and I'm looking forward to having you apply and reflect on the things that we've talked about. Hopefully, they're of use to you, and you can put them to use today and in the future. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.